The wind carried the smell of salt across the busy harbor. Ships from distant lands slowly entered the port, their sails torn by storms and long weeks at sea. Merchants stood on the docks, eager to unload silk, spices, gold, and precious goods from the east. Nobody noticed the tiny creatures hiding below the wooden decks. Nobody imagined that these ships carried something far more valuable and far more treasure than treasure. Hidden among sacks of grain and bundles of cloth were black rats. On their bodies lived hungry fleas. Inside those fleas was an invisible enemy that would soon change the history of the world forever. This enemy was the plague. Today, scientists call it the Black Death, one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. During the 14th century, it spread across Europe, Asia, and North Africa, killing millions of people. In many parts of Europe, nearly half of the population disappeared within only a few years. Entire families vanished. Villages became empty, great cities fell silent. But to understand how this nightmare began, we must travel back many centuries. The exact birthplace of the plague remains uncertain. Most historians believe the disease originated somewhere in Central Asia. The bacteria responsible for the illness lived naturally among wild rodents. For centuries, the disease stayed in remote regions, hidden from the great civilizations of Europe. Then, the world became more connected. Trade routes stretched across continents like giant webs. Merchants traveled thousands of miles along the famous Silk Road, carrying expensive goods between east and west. Caravans crossed deserts, ships sailed dangerous seas. Every journey brought cultures closer together. Unfortunately, diseases traveled just as easily as people. In the early 1340s, the plague began moving westward. Cities along the trade routes experienced mysterious outbreaks. People developed sudden fevers, unbearable pain, and strange black swellings on their bodies. Many died within only a few days. No one knew why. The disease continued its silent march. One of the most important moments came in 1346 during the siege of the Crimean port city of Kaffa. The city was an important trading center where merchants from many nations met to exchange goods. As the siege continued, something strange happened. The attacking army was suddenly struck by a terrible illness. Soldiers began collapsing one after another, their skin darkened, pain spread through their bodies, death followed quickly. Instead of ending the siege, the attackers made a horrifying decision. According to several historical accounts, they used catapults to throw the bodies of plague victims over the city walls. Whether this event happened exactly as described remains debated by historians, but it became one of history's most famous stories about biological warfare. Inside the city, fear grew. The merchants realized they had to escape before it was too late. They boarded their ships and sailed toward Europe. What they did not know was that they had already invited death aboard. The ships looked completely normal as they crossed the Mediterranean Sea. Sailors worked hard every day, adjusting sails and navigating rough waters. Some crew members became sick during the voyage. A few died before reaching land. The surviving sailors believed bad air or divine punishment had caused the illness. No one suspected the rats hiding below deck. The fleas feeding on those rats carried the bacteria from one host to another. Whenever a rat died, the fleas searched for new blood. Humans became their next victims. In October 1347, several trading ships arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina. People gathered at the harbor, expecting another profitable trading day. Instead, they witnessed something horrifying. Many sailors were already dead. Others could barely stand. Their bodies were covered with dark swellings the size of eggs. Their skin showed strange black patches. They burned with fever and coughed constantly. Some screamed in pain. Others stared silently into space before collapsing. The citizens of Messina immediately realized something was terribly wrong. The ships were ordered to leave the harbor, but it was already too late. The invisible enemy had already stepped onto European soil. Within days, local residents began showing the same terrifying symptoms. Healthy people woke up feeling weak. By afternoon, they had high fever. By evening, painful swellings appeared under their arms, around their necks, or in their groin. Many victims could no longer walk. Some became confused and spoke nonsense. Others suffered unbearable thirst. Then came the black spots. These dark marks appeared because tiny blood vessels beneath the skin burst as the infection spread through the body. To frightened medieval people, it looked as if death itself had painted their skin. Many victims died within 2 or 3 days, some died within 24 hours. Doctors were completely helpless. Medicine during the Middle Ages was very different from modern science. Physicians believed diseases were caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids called humors. Others blamed poisonous air, unusual weather, or the positions of planets and stars. Many treatments only made patients suffer more. Doctors cut open swellings hoping to remove the illness. Some burned herbs inside homes. Others recommended drinking strange mixtures containing flowers, minerals, or even crushed gemstones. Nothing worked. As deaths increased, fear spread even faster than the disease itself. Families locked themselves inside their homes. Parents watched helplessly as their children became sick. Children saw their parents die before their eyes. Neighbors stopped visiting one another. Friends avoided even speaking face to face. Markets became quieter every day. Church bells rang constantly. Funerals became so common that people stopped counting them. Soon entire streets fell silent. Travelers unknowingly carried the plague to new cities. Merchant ships reached Marseille in France. From there, trade routes carried the disease inland. Within months, the plague spread across Italy, France, Spain, and beyond. Every road became a pathway for death. Every crowded marketplace became a place of infection. Every celebration risked becoming a funeral. No kingdom escaped the growing disaster. Kings received reports describing entire villages disappearing. Monasteries lost nearly all their monks. Castles shut their gates. Farmers abandoned fields because there was no one left to harvest crops. Even animals wandered through empty villages, searching for owners who would never return. People searched desperately for answers. Some believed God was punishing humanity for its sins. Others accused strangers of bringing the disease. Rumors spread faster than facts. Fear turned neighbor against neighbor. Many believed that simply looking at a sick person could spread the illness. Others carried flowers under their noses, hoping pleasant smells would protect them from poisonous air. Some wore special charms around their necks. Many spent entire days praying. Nothing seemed to stop the Black Death. The plague ignored wealth, it ignored power, it ignored age. A rich merchant could die beside a poor farmer. A nobleman could perish alongside his servant. A child could die before reaching adulthood. Death treated everyone equally. The speed of the disease shocked everyone. One week a family laughed together around a dinner table. The next week every chair was empty. People who survived often carried emotional scars for the rest of their lives. Imagine waking each morning wondering whether your loved ones would still be alive by sunset. Imagine hearing funeral bells every hour. Imagine watching entire neighborhoods disappear within weeks. For millions of people, this was no nightmare, it was reality. The Black Death had only just arrived. Europe did not yet understand that it was standing at the beginning of one of the greatest disasters in human history. The worst was still to come. When the first cases of the plague appeared, many people believed that the sickness would disappear within a few weeks. Europe had experienced diseases before. Cities often faced outbreaks of fever or dysentery, and life usually returned to normal. But this time was different. The Black Death did not slow down, it grew stronger. Like a dark storm crossing the continent, it moved from one town to another, from one kingdom to the next. Every road, every river, and every trade route became a highway for death. Merchants carried it unknowingly, travelers spread it without realizing it. Even families fleeing infected cities often brought the disease with them. By the beginning of 1348, panic had taken hold across Europe. In Italy, entire neighborhoods became silent. In France, church bells rang almost without stopping. In Spain, priests prayed over endless lines of dying people. England watched in horror as ships arrived carrying not only goods, but also sickness. No one knew where it would strike next. Every cough caused fear. Every fever became a death sentence. Every knock on the door filled families with terror. The plague attacked quickly. A healthy man could wake up in the morning, eat breakfast with his family, and begin his work as usual. By midday, he would complain of chills and a pounding headache. Within hours, a high fever would burn through his body. Painful swellings, known today as buboes, appeared beneath his arms or around his neck. Soon the pain became unbearable. Some victims cried out until they lost their voices. Others became too weak even to speak. Many began coughing blood. Some suffered from severe confusion. They no longer recognized their own children. They spoke to people who were not there. They wandered through the streets, barely aware of where they were going. Most never recovered. Death often came within 3 or 4 days. Sometimes it came in less than 24 hours. The speed frightened everyone.
Doctors had no answers. At that time, medicine was based more on ancient beliefs than on scientific knowledge. Physicians wore long robes and carried books filled with theories passed down through generations. They studied the stars, they examined a patient's urine, they checked the color of the skin and listened carefully to the heartbeat. But no matter what they tried, patients continued to die. Some doctors believed that bad air caused the disease. They burned sweet-smelling herbs inside homes, hoping to clean the air. Others advised people to carry flowers wherever they went. Wealthy citizens filled small bags with lavender, rosemary and mint, believing pleasant scents could keep death away. It did not. Another common treatment involved bloodletting. Doctors believed that removing blood would restore balance inside the body. They cut veins with sharp knives or attached leeches to the patient's skin. The patients only became weaker. Still, people continued searching for hope. Some believed that expensive medicines imported from distant lands would save them. Others trusted magical stones, lucky charms, or ancient prayers. None of them stopped the plague. As the weeks passed, hospitals overflowed. Soon there were too many patients. Doctors became sick, nurses became sick, priests became sick. Even the people digging graves became sick. Entire medical staffs disappeared. In many towns there was no one left to care for the dying. Families faced impossible choices. A mother watched her child develop a fever. Should she stay beside the bed and risk becoming infected herself, or should she leave to protect the rest of her family? Many stayed, many died together. Others were too frightened to help. There were heartbreaking stories of parents abandoning children, children abandoning parents, and husbands leaving wives behind. Fear was stronger than love for many people. Not because they were cruel, because they believed staying meant certain death. Soon the number of bodies became overwhelming. At first, every victim received a proper funeral. Friends gathered, priests prayed, families cried. But as thousands died every week, traditions collapsed. There was simply no time. Large pits were dug outside city walls. Wagons loaded with bodies rolled through empty streets from sunrise until nightfall. Workers wearing cloth over their faces lifted one body after another into the mass graves. Some victims were buried without names, others without families, many without anyone knowing they had died. The smell of death spread through entire cities. People closed their windows even during hot summer days. Dogs barked at abandoned houses. Cats wandered through empty streets. In some villages, no one remained alive to ring the church bell. Silence replaced the sounds of everyday life. The economy also began to collapse. Markets closed because merchants were dead. Shops stood empty. Blacksmiths stopped making tools. Millers no longer ground grain. Ships remained in harbors because crews refused to sail. Farmers abandoned fields. There were too few workers left to plant crops or harvest food. As supplies became scarce, prices rose rapidly. Even survivors struggled to find bread. Hunger followed disease. Entire regions faced famine. Kings and queens watched helplessly. Royal palaces closed their gates. Many rulers fled to the countryside, hoping to escape crowded cities. Some succeeded, many did not. The plague cared nothing about crowns. Nobles died beside servants. Bishops died beside beggars. Power offered no protection. One of the most famous stories from this period comes from the Italian city of Florence. Before the plague, Florence had been one of Europe's richest and most beautiful cities. Artists, merchants and scholars filled its streets. Then the plague arrived. Within months, thousands were dead. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio later described streets filled with silence, abandoned homes, and neighbors too frightened even to greet one another. Families locked themselves indoors. Many believed every stranger carried death. His writings remain one of the most powerful eyewitness accounts of the Black Death. As fear spread, people searched desperately for someone to blame. Without understanding bacteria or fleas, many believed the disaster had been caused deliberately. Rumors spread wildly. Some claimed foreigners had poisoned wells. Others accused travelers. Entire communities became victims of suspicion and violence. These accusations were false, but fear often overcame reason. History remembers this period not only for the terrible disease, but also for the suffering caused by panic and prejudice. Meanwhile, another strange group appeared on Europe's roads. They were called the Flagellants. These men believed the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins. To seek forgiveness, they traveled from town to town, whipping themselves with leather straps tipped with metal. Blood covered their backs as they marched through streets, praying loudly. Crowds gathered to watch them. Some people joined them, others believed they were spreading even more fear. Eventually, many governments ordered the groups to stop, but by then desperation had reached unimaginable levels. People began recording the days differently. Instead of remembering birthdays or festivals, they remembered who had died. The baker died last Monday. My brother died yesterday. Our neighbors are gone. Death became part of daily conversation. Children grew up surrounded by grief. Many never saw their grandparents. Some became orphans before reaching the age of 10. Entire generations were marked forever. Yet, amid all the darkness, there were also extraordinary acts of courage. Some doctors continued treating patients even after watching their friends die.
Many priests stayed with the sick until the very end, offering comfort despite knowing they might become infected themselves. Neighbors secretly left food outside abandoned homes. Mothers risked their own lives to care for feverish children. Ordinary people performed extraordinary acts simply because someone needed help. Their bravery often went unnoticed, but without them, even more lives would have been lost. By the end of 1349, Europe had changed beyond recognition. Millions were dead, thousands of villages had disappeared from maps forever, countless families had been erased from history. No one knew exactly how many people had died, there were simply too many to count. Some historians estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population perished during the Black Death. It was one of the greatest human disasters ever recorded. Yet the plague had not finished changing the world. The survivors now faced a different challenge.
How do you rebuild a civilization when half of your neighbors are gone? How do you plant fields with no farmers? How do you reopen schools with no teachers? How do you believe in tomorrow after watching yesterday disappear? These questions would shape the future of Europe for generations, and in the years that followed, the consequences of the Black Death would transform society forever. By the year 1350, the worst waves of the Black Death had begun to slow in some parts of Europe. The church bells no longer rang every hour. Fewer wagons carried bodies through the streets. In many towns, people cautiously opened their doors and stepped outside for the first time in months. But what they saw was heartbreaking. The world they remembered was gone. Entire neighborhoods stood empty, houses were locked, their owners long dead. Windows were broken, gardens had become wild, weeds grew between the stones of abandoned streets, wind blew through open doors, carrying only silence. In many villages, there was no one left at all. Fields that had once been filled with farmers were covered in tall grass. Cattle wandered freely without owners. Chickens searched for food in deserted farmyards. Wells stood unused and mills no longer turned. Nature slowly reclaimed places where people had lived for generations. Travelers described villages where every house was empty. They could walk from one end of the settlement to the other without seeing a single person. It was as if the people had simply disappeared. In reality, they had. The Black Death had killed millions. No one knew the exact number. Medieval governments did not keep detailed records, and many local officials had died during the epidemic themselves. Modern historians estimate that between 25 and 50 million people died across Europe, while millions more died in Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. Never before had so many lives been lost in such a short time. The plague did not only take lives, it changed everything. One of the first problems was food. Before the plague, Europe had many mouths to feed. Farmers worked hard from sunrise to sunset, growing wheat, barley, vegetables, and raising animals. Every harvest required thousands of workers. Now there were not enough people left. Many farms were abandoned because entire families had died. Crops rotted in the fields. Fruit fell from trees and was never picked. Sheep wandered without shepherds. Food became scarce in many places. Yet something unexpected also happened. Because there were fewer people, there was more land available for those who survived. Workers suddenly became valuable. Before the plague, peasants often had little choice about where they worked. Powerful landowners controlled large estates and laborers received very low wages. After the Black Death, everything changed. A farmer could now choose where to work. If one landowner refused to pay a fair wage, another might offer more money. For the first time in generations, ordinary workers gained new opportunities. Many demanded better conditions. Some even refused to work unless they received higher pay. Landowners were shocked. For centuries they had held most of the power. Now they struggled to find workers. Governments tried to stop wages from rising. In England, new laws ordered workers to accept the same low pay they had received before the plague, but enforcing these laws proved difficult. If one village offered better wages, workers simply moved there. The balance of power was slowly changing. Historians believe this shift helped weaken the old feudal system that had dominated medieval Europe for hundreds of years. The Black Death had done something armies had failed to do. It had changed society itself. Cities also faced enormous challenges. Many skilled craftsmen had died. There were fewer blacksmiths to make tools, fewer carpenters to build houses, fewer teachers to educate children, fewer priests to lead churches. Communities struggled to replace those who had been lost. Young people suddenly found themselves taking on responsibilities much earlier than expected. Teenagers inherited farms. Young apprentices became master craftsmen. Children who had lost their parents learned to survive on their own. An entire generation grew up much faster than anyone had imagined. The emotional wounds were just as deep. Nearly everyone had lost someone: a father, a mother, a husband, a wife, a brother, a sister, a child. There were few families untouched by grief. Many people questioned everything they had once believed. Some wondered why God had allowed so much suffering. Others lost faith completely. Some became even more religious, spending hours every day in prayer. People searched desperately for meaning in a world that suddenly seemed uncertain. Artists also changed. Before the plague, paintings often celebrated beauty, wealth, and religious glory. After the Black Death, many artists began painting death itself. Skeletons appeared in murals. Paintings showed kings, queens, farmers, priests, and children walking together toward the grave. These works reminded viewers of a simple truth: no matter how rich or powerful you were, death came for everyone. This idea became known as the Dance of Death. It appeared in churches, books, and public art across Europe. It reflected the lessons people had learned during the plague. Life was fragile. No one knew what tomorrow would bring. Writers also recorded the tragedy. One of the most famous was the Italian author Giovanni Boccaccio. In his masterpiece The Decameron, he imagined 10 young people escaping plague-stricken Florence by hiding in the countryside. To pass the time, they told one another stories. Some stories were funny, others were romantic, some were tragic. Together, they painted a picture of a society trying to find hope after unimaginable loss. The book remains one of the greatest literary works of the Middle Ages. The plague also transformed medicine. Doctors realized many of their old beliefs had failed. Although they still did not know about bacteria, they began paying closer attention to observation instead of relying only on ancient texts. Cities introduced new health measures. Some ports required arriving ships to remain isolated before passengers could enter. This practice became known as quarantine. The word comes from the Italian quaranta, meaning 40, because ships were often required to wait 40 days before docking. It was one of history's first organized public health systems. People were slowly learning. Knowledge grew from tragedy. Trade eventually returned, markets reopened, ships once again crossed the Mediterranean, merchants cautiously resumed business, children's laughter slowly returned to village streets, churches filled with worshippers. Life began again. But it was never exactly the same. Every survivor carried memories. A grandmother remembered the daughter she had buried. A blacksmith remembered the friends who had once worked beside him. A king remembered the empty castles across his kingdom. The plague had become part of their lives forever. It also changed the way people viewed time. Money began planning for the future more carefully. Some donated money to hospitals, others built churches or schools in memory of loved ones. Families treasured every moment together because they understood how quickly everything could disappear. The Black Death had taught humanity a painful lesson. Life was precious. It could never be taken for granted. Historians often ask an important question: how did Europe recover after losing so many people? The answer is surprisingly simple, because people refused to give up. They planted new fields, they rebuilt homes, they reopened workshops, they taught their children, they fell in love again, they laughed again, they dreamed again. Humanity had been wounded, but it had not been defeated. This remarkable ability to recover became one of the greatest stories in history. Out of enormous tragedy came unexpected change. Better wages, new opportunities, improved public health, fresh ideas. A society that slowly began moving toward the modern world. The Black Death had destroyed millions of lives, yet it also forced Europe to transform in ways no one could have imagined. Still, one frightening truth remained. The plague had disappeared. But it had not vanished forever. In the centuries ahead, it would return again and again, reminding the world that this invisible enemy had not been completely defeated. For many people, it felt like the nightmare would never end. Years had passed since the first infected ships arrived in Europe. Millions of people were gone. Entire families had vanished from history. Every city carried scars that would remain for generations. Then, slowly, something began to change. The number of new infections started to fall. At first, no one noticed. One village reported fewer deaths, then another town. A busy city that had buried hundreds of people every week suddenly buried only dozens. People were afraid to believe it. After everything they had witnessed, hope felt dangerous. Many had already celebrated too early, before the plague returned. So they waited. Weeks passed, then months. The Black Death was finally beginning to lose its grip. No one in the 14th century understood why. Today, historians and scientists believe several factors played a role. The disease had already infected millions of people. Many had died, while some who survived may have developed a degree of immunity. In many places, there were simply fewer people living close together, making it harder for the plague to spread. Another important change was human behavior. During the early years of the epidemic, people had continued traveling, trading and gathering in large crowds because they did not understand the danger. Now they had learned. If sickness appeared in one town, nearby villages often closed their gates, travelers were turned away, markets were cancelled, families avoided unnecessary contact. These actions could not stop every outbreak, but they slowed the spread. One of the most important ideas born during this time was quarantine. The city-states of Italy depended heavily on trade. Ships arrived every day from distant lands, carrying silk, spices, timber and precious metals. They could also carry disease. Officials realized that allowing every ship to enter immediately was too dangerous. Instead, arriving vessels were ordered to wait offshore before anyone could leave. For 40 days, sailors remained on board while authorities watched for signs of illness. If no one became sick, the ship could finally enter the harbor. If disease appeared, the vessel remained isolated. The system was far from perfect, but it worked better than doing nothing. This simple idea saved countless lives in the centuries that followed. Many cities also created new health boards. Their job was to monitor outbreaks, inspect ships, organize cleaning efforts, and isolate infected homes. These were some of the earliest forms of organized public health in Europe. The plague had forced governments to think differently. Protecting public health became a responsibility, not just a personal matter. Doctors also changed. The physicians who survived the epidemic realized that many traditional treatments had failed. Bloodletting had not saved patients. Expensive potions had not saved patients. Astrology had not saved patients. Although they still lacked modern scientific knowledge, some doctors began relying more on careful observation than on ancient theories. They kept records, they compared symptoms, they looked for patterns. Slowly, medicine began moving toward a more scientific future. Still, the plague had not disappeared forever. Every few years, new outbreaks appeared somewhere in Europe. Sometimes they remained small, sometimes they grew into regional epidemics. Cities that believed themselves safe suddenly found new cases within their walls. Fear returned each time. People remembered the horrors of the first great epidemic. The sight of a single infected traveler could empty an entire marketplace. Parents kept children indoors, churches filled with frightened worshippers. No one wanted history to repeat itself. One of the most famous later outbreaks occurred in London during 1665. More than 300 years after the Black Death first reached Europe, the plague returned once again. Thousands died, red crosses were painted on the doors of infected houses, entire families were locked inside to prevent the disease from spreading. The city once again faced terror. But something was different. Authorities responded more quickly. Quarantine rules were enforced. Officials tracked cases. Although many people still died, society was far better prepared than it had been during the 14th century. The lessons of history were beginning to save lives. The plague also influenced architecture. Cities gradually became cleaner. Some narrow streets were widened. Waste disposal improved. Fresh water became more important. People slowly recognized that cleaner environments reduced disease, even if they did not fully understand why. Hospitals also changed. Instead of simply caring for the sick, many began separating patients with different illnesses. Isolation became an important medical practice. The idea was simple: keep the disease away from healthy people. Today, this may seem obvious. In the Middle Ages, it was revolutionary. The Black Death also changed how governments collected information. Officials wanted to know how many people had died, where outbreaks had appeared, and how quickly diseases spread. Better record-keeping gradually became part of public administration. These records help historians understand the pandemic even today. But perhaps the greatest change happened inside people's minds. Survivors had lived through unimaginable suffering. They had watched parents bury children, children bury parents, friends disappear within days. No one who experienced the plague remained unchanged. Many people became more compassionate. Communities supported widows and orphans. Charities grew. Hospitals received donations. Others became determined to understand nature instead of simply fearing it. Curiosity slowly replaced superstition. Questions replaced blind acceptance. This change would eventually contribute to one of the greatest periods in European history, the Renaissance. Artists, scientists, engineers, and thinkers began exploring the world with new determination. Human knowledge expanded rapidly. Although the plague had caused terrible destruction, it also encouraged people to seek better answers. Centuries later, scientists finally discovered the true cause of the disease. The plague was not a punishment from the stars. It was not caused by bad smells. It was not created by evil spirits. It was caused by a tiny bacterium called Yersinia pestis. The bacteria lived in fleas, which often fed on infected rodents. When fleas bit humans, the infection spread. This discovery changed medicine forever. For the first time, humanity understood its invisible enemy. Today, plague still exists in a few parts of the world.
However, modern antibiotics can usually treat the disease successfully if patients receive medical care quickly. What once destroyed kingdoms can now often be cured. This remarkable progress reminds us how powerful science has become. Yet the memory of the Black Death has never disappeared. Old cemeteries still contain the remains of plague victims. Ancient churches still display paintings inspired by the epidemic. Historical documents preserve the voices of people who witnessed those terrible years. They remind us that behind every number was a human life, a father, a daughter, a friend, a neighbor, someone who loved, dreamed, hoped, and loved. History is not only about dates and statistics, it is about people. The Black Death eventually faded, but its lessons remained. Humanity had learned that diseases could cross borders, that fear could spread faster than truth, that preparation mattered.
That science saved lives, and that even after the darkest chapters in history, people could rebuild their world. But one final question remained: how much had the Black Death truly changed civilization? The answer would echo through the centuries, because its greatest legacy was not only the millions it killed, it was the new world it helped create. The Black Death finally faded from Europe, but its shadow never truly disappeared. Long after the mass graves were covered with earth, long after abandoned villages were reclaimed by nature, and long after the church bells stopped ringing for the dead, people continued to remember. Parents told their children stories about the terrible years when death walked through every street. Grandparents spoke about neighbors who had vanished in only a few days. Writers filled books with memories of the epidemic. Artists painted scenes of skeletons, empty cities, and frightened families. The plague became more than a disease. It became a warning that even the greatest civilizations are not invincible. Today, nearly 700 years later, historians still study the Black Death because it changed the course of human history in ways that few other events ever have. Before the plague, medieval Europe looked very different. Most people were poor farmers. Power belonged to kings, nobles, and wealthy landowners. The church influenced nearly every part of daily life. Opportunities for ordinary people were limited. Then the Black Death arrived. Within just a few years, everything changed. Millions of workers were gone. Landowners desperately needed laborers. Survivors could demand better wages, better working conditions, and greater freedom. Many families moved to larger towns and cities in search of new opportunities. Trade slowly expanded. Businesses grew. The middle class became stronger. The old social order began to weaken. Historians often say that the plague helped open the door to the modern world. It did not cause every change by itself, but it accelerated changes that might otherwise have taken centuries. The economy transformed, politics transformed, society transformed, and so did science. For hundreds of years before the plague, many people accepted ancient medical ideas without questioning them. Doctors often repeated treatments that had been used for generations. If a patient died, they believed it was simply God's will. But after watching millions perish, many physicians realized that old beliefs were not enough. People began asking difficult questions. Why do diseases spread? Can they be prevented? How can doctors discover the real causes of illness? These questions became the foundation of modern medicine. Over the centuries, scientists made incredible discoveries. The invention of the microscope revealed an invisible world filled with tiny living organisms. Researchers discovered bacteria. They learned how infections spread. Hospitals became cleaner. Surgery became safer. Vaccines protected millions from deadly diseases. Antibiotics transformed medicine. The invisible enemy that once terrified Europe could finally be understood. The plague also changed the way governments responded to public health. During the Middle Ages, there were almost no organized systems for controlling epidemics. After the Black Death, cities began creating permanent health offices. Officials inspected ships arriving from overseas. Doctors reported unusual illnesses. Quarantine stations became common in busy ports. Many of these ideas remain part of modern public health today. Whenever a dangerous disease appears, governments monitor outbreaks, share information, and work together to protect their populations. The lessons learned during the 14th century still guide the world. The Black Death also left a deep mark on art and literature. Painters no longer focused only on kings and saints. Many began painting ordinary people. Life itself became more valuable because everyone understood how quickly it could disappear. Themes of life, death, hope, and survival appeared everywhere. Books written after the plague often explored human emotions more deeply than before. One disaster had changed not only history, but also imagination. Religion changed as well. Some people lost faith after witnessing so much suffering. Others became even more devoted. The church remained powerful, but many individuals began thinking for themselves in new ways. Questions that had once seemed impossible were now openly discussed. This growing curiosity helped prepare Europe for the Renaissance, a period of remarkable creativity, scientific discovery, and cultural achievement. Great artists, engineers, and thinkers would soon reshape civilization. In many ways, the Renaissance grew from the ashes of the plague. Yet perhaps the most important lesson was not about science, politics, or economics. It was about humanity. During the darkest years of the epidemic, fear often divided people. Neighbors avoided one another. Families were separated. False rumors led to hatred and violence against innocent communities. History reminds us that fear can become almost as dangerous as the disease itself. But history also remembers another side. Doctors who refused to abandon their patients, nurses who cared for strangers, priests who stayed beside the dying, neighbors who secretly delivered food to isolated families, parents who risked everything to comfort their children. These quiet acts of courage rarely appear in history books, yet they saved countless lives. The Black Death showed both the worst and the best of human nature. It revealed how fear could spread, but it also revealed how compassion could survive even in the darkest moments. Centuries later, the world would face new pandemics: cholera, influenza, smallpox, and in recent history, COVID-19. Each time, humanity relied on lessons learned from the past. Scientists worked together across borders, doctors shared knowledge, governments introduced quarantine measures when necessary.
Researchers developed medicines and vaccines faster than ever before. Although every disease is different, the basic lesson remains the same. Knowledge saves lives, cooperation saves lives, preparation saves lives. Today, the plague has not completely disappeared. Small outbreaks still occur in a few parts of the world, usually among wild rodents. However, thanks to modern medicine, the disease is now rare and in most cases treatable if diagnosed early. The terrifying epidemic that once destroyed kingdoms has become a disease doctors know how to fight. That is one of humanity's greatest achievements. But perhaps the greatest victory is memory. We remember the millions who never had the chance to tell their own stories. We remember the families that disappeared, the children who never grew up, the cities that nearly vanished, the doctors who fought without understanding the enemy, the ordinary people who showed extraordinary courage. History gives them a voice. Every old cemetery,
Every ruined village, every faded document, every ancient church, they all whisper the same message: never forget. The Black Death was one of the darkest chapters in human history. It killed millions, it shattered kingdoms, it changed economies, it transformed medicine, it reshaped society, and it forever altered the relationship between humanity and disease. Yet despite everything, humanity survived. People rebuilt their homes, they planted new fields, they reopened schools, they created new inventions, they explored new worlds. They wrote books, painted masterpieces, built universities, made scientific discoveries. Generation after generation, people proved something stronger than any plague: hope. Because history is not only the story of disasters, it is the story of survival. The Black Death reminds us that civilizations can fall into darkness, but it also reminds us that people have an extraordinary ability to rise again. No matter how terrible the storm, no matter how deep the fear, no matter how great the loss, humanity continues to move forward. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. Not that the Black Death killed millions, but that, after one of the greatest tragedies the world has ever known, humanity still found the strength to build a better future.